introduce our next speaker, whose topic is very much in the news at the moment, really. And she is addressing a topic with vaccinations that as parents we've all had to address and really have to think about. And Magda started doing this with her own young children in 1991. And she runs a website called The Informed Parent and has lots of information, and she has newsletters, so you can sign up for that if you want to know more about it. So I'm going to hand over to her because she does have an awful lot that she wishes to convey to us. So ladies and gentlemen, give a warm welcome to Magda Taylor.
I am going to speak quite swiftly because there is a lot, and I am going to spend a bit of time on the history because it's very important, because we all grew up believing smallpox was eradicated by vaccination, and I'm sort of seeing now in the last 20, 30 years that we're starting to see the same kind of thing that happened back in the 1800s, except we're now talking about measles, the deadly disease. So I will be reading all these slides to you, but you can read, obviously, as you're looking, but I probably won't be able to enlarge on them because of the time, and I really want to try and touch on so many things, because at this point in time, mandatory vaccines are breathing down our necks in this country. So I'm going to start, just before I go on to the smallpox vaccine, a little tiny bit more going back to the 9th century, just a couple of views from a doctor in the 16th century and also the 9th century, and their view on smallpox. So Rhazes was an Arabian scientist, Persian scientist, and a very important figure in the history of medicine. And he described smallpox as being due to the fermentation of the blood. And he wrote many volumes on smallpox and measles, and these are the sort of things he noted: that it was seasonal, particularly in spring, predominantly in children. He felt it was the result of something innate in each child, and that the nature of the disease was matter being discharged from the pustules, suggesting that something undesirable was being eliminated through the skin. So the main aim of treatment, obviously, would be to redress the balance. Very holistic view, very much how naturopathic medicine and holistics see acute virals like measles, trying to throw stuff out in childhood. Then we go to the 1600s. Dr. Sydenham, he was the English Hippocrates, and he referred to smallpox as also a specific inflammation of the blood, and he also recognized the mild and severe types, meaning the mild form had been in existence long before vaccination was introduced. Because, of course, when you introduce a vaccine, suddenly everyone's getting a much milder disease if they happen to have already been vaccinated. That's what we get told. And he also thought it was there was a danger of too much interference when treating smallpox. And he said here, "As it is palpable to all the world how fatal that disease proves to many of all ages, so it is more clear to me from all the observations that I can possibly make, that if no mischief be done either by physician or nurse, it is the most slight and safe of all other diseases." So he was talking about smallpox in the 1600s with that kind of look upon the disease. Neither of those two characters, Rhazes or Sydenham, attached much importance to contagiousness, whereas nowadays we're told you just have to be standing next to someone at a bus stop and they'll sneeze on you and you'll suddenly have some kind of flu, or a child on the bus with measles and you'll suddenly find yourself with measles. So in the 19th century, 1800s, smallpox came under a title of a zymotic disease. It was the sort of term to cover all those diseases and fevers: typhoid, measles, scarlet fever, cholera, etc. And they were looked upon as diseases arising from the violation of the laws of health and cleanliness, neglect of sanitation, etc. So they were also looking at trying to throw rubbish out of the body. They were looked upon. So they were a cleansing and curative effort of the body to purge the system of impurities. So when you look back at the last few centuries, when sanitary and hygienic laws were obviously not adhered to or achieved, then of course we had plague, jail fever and Black Death. And then with partial improvement in social conditions, these were replaced by smallpox, cholera, typhus. And then by the 1930s, with further improvement, smallpox diminishing, we had those diseases more, measles, diphtheria, scarlatina, and all that kind of thing. So what was the causation? Well, it was clearly the primary causes were the state of the body, overcrowded living, lack of personal hygiene, little or no ventilation, and backwards sanitation. And there's a lovely book, The Vaccination Problem. It's on my website. I scanned it in manually so that people can download a free PDF. And the author said, in any case, it is safe to say that the association of foul air, i.e. air polluted by human exhalations, and smallpox has not yet received the investigation that it deserves, and will doubtless receive when the downfall of the practice of vaccination leaves the medical profession in a position to face the subject with open eyes and unprejudiced minds. Well, he said that quite about a century ago, so unfortunately it's not going that way at the moment, but there is growing awareness. So fresh air was really the enemy of smallpox, and a chap, Robert Rawlinson, 1888, in the Times said, "I've seen smallpox patients exposed in an English summer, placed under open sheds and in barns, sleeping on straw and fed by the cottagers of the district with food of the simplest character. The result being that not one patient so treated died, neither did the disease spread, and yet many deaths taking place among the afflicted who remained in their houses, overcrowded, no ventilation, etc." The century before Jenner came along with his vaccines, there was a technique taken up. They referred to it initially as inoculation, sometimes variolation, but we're calling it inoculation for now. And that came along because of Lady Montagu, who was the wife of the British ambassador out in Turkey. She saw this technique being used, and she allowed her little son to be inoculated in 1717. On her return, her daughter was also inoculated, and she started to encourage King George I to look into this, and experiments were conducted on condemned criminals, which appeared successful, but further experiments resulted in fatalities. So it sort of lost favour for a while, but by the mid-1700s, it started to take hold again, and more doctors in UK, they started to have certain techniques, and they claimed success, and it was starting to be used. However, there were great concerns that inoculation was actually spreading the disease. The mortality from smallpox in London on the whole was higher during the 1700s and the 1600s, and there was adequate evidence that inoculation was the prime cause of the increase. So that was what was going on. So we're coming to the vaccine part now. Edward Jenner, aged 13, he became an apprentice for 6 years to a local surgeon, and during that time, he apparently had heard about a distemper, meaning a fever type of thing, cowpox, that was rife in the dairies and which infected the hands of the milkers, and that this sometimes resulted apparently in the prevention of smallpox. Jenner, in the late 18th century, was speculating on the way diseases in man may have arisen from the domestication of animals. Jenner believed that a disease in the horses called grease, an inflammation of swelling in the horse's heel, had a strong resemblance to smallpox in humans. These are just speculations. Jenner wondered perhaps if the men dressing the infected horses' heels, then milking the cows, neglecting their attention to cleanliness, could infect the cows' nipples, giving them cowpox, which in turn could then pass to the other milkers, and that those affected would be protected from smallpox. In May 1796, he inoculated the son of his gardener, an 8-year-old boy, James Phipps, with a matter taken from a pustule on the infected hand of a milkmaid, Sarah Nelms. And what I forgot to mention, in the 1700s, what they were doing, they were making an incision and they were using the pus from actual smallpox victims. So they were breaking pustules of smallpox victims and then using that to rub into the incision. Whereas now, Jenner is using the pus taken from the cowpox pustule. That's the difference. And the boy seemed to be fine after that. And so a couple of months later, Jenner then inoculated James Phipps again. But this time he did use fresh smallpox matter from the lesion. And just because no disease developed, then Jenner concluded the protection was complete and Phipps was now immune to smallpox. So he submitted a paper to the Royal Society describing his experiment, but was told that his ideas were too revolutionary and that he needed more proof. Undaunted, Jenner experimented on several other children, even including his own 11-month-old son, which I must say, I wonder how many doctors would do that now. In 1798, the results were finally published, and Jenner coined the word vaccine from the Latin vacca, for cow. And as it happens, throughout Jenner's son's life, he did get revaccinated a number of times, and sadly he died at the age of 21 of tuberculosis, which is very much a disease of a compromised system. So, in 1802, then Jenner applied to Parliament for monetary reward. A petition was presented to the House of Commons, and just by a narrow majority, 59 to 56 votes, Jenner was awarded a grant of £10,000, which equivalent to around that amount in brackets of today's money. Vaccination then became a state-endowed institution, which strengthened its position against any opposition. Jenner and his friends made another appeal to Parliament 5 years later, 1807, and they were awarded a further £20,000 of public money. And as the author of the book says, and this was in a time of war and scarcity, but it was public money they were using, which they tend to do still with all these issues, and we pay for it basically. Smallpox inoculation versus vaccination. Now we have anti-vaccine versus pro. Well, in those days, of course, you had two different types of doctors. And as it says here, 1807, the Royal College of Physicians, after having formally blessed inoculation in 1754, they changed their opinion and condemned the practice in the following terms. However beneficial the inoculation of the smallpox may have been to individuals, it appears to have kept up a constant source of contagion, which has been the means of increasing the number of deaths by what is called the natural disease. So they were admitting it was spreading the disease. Then came a bit of a battle. Jenner and his friends fought furiously against the practice of inoculation, and as a result of their efforts, it was later made a criminal offence in 1840, punishable by 1 month's imprisonment without the option of a fine. So there you are, sort of 100 years after they'd embraced it in the 1700s. Now it's an offence and you get imprisoned. So why was vaccination embraced? Well, the theory was much more appealing, as it promised to be less harmful when it first came on the scene, because you're not using smallpox pus, you're using cowpox pus, and that was seen as safer. However, from around 1808 onwards, there was an increase in public distrust of vaccination, numerous failures revealed, mounting evidence that it was dangerous, ineffective, and sometimes fatal. So, of course, Jenner then found himself being targeted by opponents of his vaccination and all the failures. And these are just a few of the sort of excuses he came up with. because of its failure. He said, effectiveness was only achieved by using genuine, true cowpox, not other similar eruptions on cows. So he must have got the wrong kind of eruption and taken the wrong amount of pus. And then you must never excessively raid the pustule. You must have taken way too much out of that pustule, and that's why it didn't work. Or the vaccinating fluid had to come from the pustules in the early stage of the development. In other words, you must have taken that pus from it when it was in a later stage. You see, all these kind of excuses. And that it should only be carried out on healthy children, free of eczema and any other skin problems. Or that the matter must have suffered decomposition through being kept for several days. Or you made a too deep incision. So these were the kind of excuses he was coming up with. Now, Jenner had received international recognition as the pioneer of vaccination against smallpox, and yet the criticism from the anti-vaccinists and the reports of its failure took a toll on his vitality. And a couple of weeks before he died, he wrote to one of his nieces. He said, "I do not think there was ever a period when I worked harder. It is no bodily exertion, of course, that I allude to, but it is that which is far more oppressive, the toils of the mind. I am harassed and oppressed beyond anything you can have a conception of." So this was a chap that was internationally recognised. You'd think he'd be strutting around the world with a smile on his face. So Dr. Hadwin, another booklet called The Case Against Vaccines, 1896, we constantly hear that Jenner received such wonderful homage in the later years of his life. We well know that his closing years were years of misery as the failure of his fetish began to crowd upon him. It was on January 23rd, 1823, that he wrote his last letter to his friend Gardner, and he told him he was never surrounded by so many perplexities. And 2 days later, Jenner breathed his last. Dr. Hadwin also mentioned, "I won't go now into the personal character of Jenner, but Dr. Creighton has well described him when he tells us that he was vain and petulant, crafty and greedy, a man who in all his writings was never precise when he could possibly be vague, and never straightforward when he could be secretive." Here's a French ad for vaccines. They're coming in, the vaccine station coming in to town, and all the locals are running off the edge of the page. So why did vaccination continue? Well, a large portion of the medical profession had accepted that vaccination protected when there was no such proof, and had completely committed Parliament to endorse this practice. The medical men and other members of the Royal Commission could not consider any negative view. The medical profession would have lost face and credibility. There would have been public outcry with all the deaths, disabilities that occurred, not to mention the vast sums of public money already invested into this procedure. So they dug their heels in. And the vaccinators started to push for more help and backing, and they appealed to Parliament. They wanted to set out a number of regularly educated vaccinators with suitable salaries set up in many districts to cover the whole of the poor population, and also to provide each vaccinator a fee every time they gave a vaccination. And the bill was passed in 1840. However, parents still refused to have their children vaccinated, and the following years led to a zealous vaccinators to push for compulsory vaccination. And we're experiencing all this very much so at the moment. It's coming across Europe, it's in Australia, in the States. There's big push, and there's also lots of mandatory vaccine programs being introduced. They don't, of course, highlight all the protests on BBC or these other mainstream media, whereas there's thousands on the streets when these kind of laws are being pushed. So in 1853, Compulsory Vaccination Act, and in the Lancet, they actually published about this act. In the public mind extensively, and in the profession itself, doubts are known to exist as to the efficacy and eligibility of vaccination,
The failures of the operation have been numerous and discouraging. Now, they published that in the Lancet, so they were admitting there were problems. So, of course, the Act came in, parents were fined 20 shillings if they refused or neglected to have their child vaccinated within 3 months of birth. And at that time, there was no impartial or reasoned opposition in place, especially in Parliament. So a year later, the first anti-vaccination pamphlet was published, and you can download this from the British Library, Our Medical Liberties, Mr. John Gibbs, and he produced a 64-page pamphlet. Now, at that time, the Public Health England were called the Epidemiological Society, and they were formed by Dr. Seaton and other vaccinators. And they continued to influence Parliament, most of whom had little knowledge on the subject. So who do they turn to? Those very people, the Epidemiological Society, for guidance. So they pushed then for further penalties. And we have the same thing now. MPs, MEPs, if you write to them, they just toe the line. They don't know much on the subject. They say it must be okay. They get all their advice from the health departments. Vaccinators, not satisfied with these 1853 Act, pushed for further bill to be introduced in 1866. There was one opposition MP, well, there were more, but this one particularly, Sir Thomas Chambers, stated, "I am persuaded that when the bill is passed, an agitation will commence that will never cease until the Act is repealed." And so, sadly, in 1868, the law was toughened, because due to increasing criticisms of vaccination and the difficulty in prosecuting and the issue that a parent could not be legally fined more than once under the 1853 Act, the vaccinators pushed for further stringent penal clauses, and finally a tougher law, January 1868, came into force, making the refusal of a parent to have their child vaccinated a continuous offence until the child reached 14 years old. So, of course, big families then, so every year you had to pay a fine for each child, 10, 15 children in your family. The fight for freedom, 1871 to 1889, the fight for freedom was at its greatest. Thousands of parents defied the law across the country and submitted to fines and imprisonment and treated like criminals whilst in prison, their only crime being to protect and preserve their child's life from vaccination. Some of the doctors or anti-vaccinists were charged verbally by the vaccinators with ignorance and dishonesty and exposing their families to smallpox. Dr. Wood alleged that a person had no right to keep an unvaccinated child any more than to keep a mad dog. And Dr. William Gull, who's featured here, said he would take a child by force from its parents and vaccinate it. By the way, I found that Dr. William Gull was actually a royal physician for a while, but he was also on the suspect list for Jack the Ripper, apparently. Anyway, opposition to the law had been increasing since 1869. The first imprisonment was in Leicester, and there was a massive demonstration in 1885. And Observer that was there said, previous to this open public revolt, prosecutions had been carried on with unrelenting zeal by the authorities of the town of Leicester. Many of the most upright, patriotic citizens had been imprisoned and treated as malefactors and had been subjected to the most degrading punishments, some being openly dragged through the streets handcuffed. There were at that time 10,000 defaulters. The demonstration was a magnificent protest against the growing tyranny. Meanwhile, there were many, many organisations cropping up around the country, and finally they merged in 1896. The National Anti-Vaccination League was formed, which actually continued to the 1950s, and there were numerous doctors involved and scientists involved in the league, and they had a regular publication called the Vaccination Enquirer. And some of their articles would say things like, when they're advertising their leaflets, dedicated to all those whose minds are sufficiently loyal to science to be free to examine without prejudice the most prejudiced question of the day. So it was the same as it is now. You're not allowed to question this subject. Finally, there was triumph in 1898. Faced with such opposition to compulsion, the Leicester Revolt, 1885, and the practical boycott of vaccination in towns such as Gloucester, the English government conceded. And they brought in the Vaccination Act, allowing parents to refuse to vaccinate their children at all. And it was the first use of the phrase conscientious objector. And the commissions did say they brought it in because they said the pressure and the penalties only encouraged resistance and did more harm than good. In the first year, 250,000 exemption certificates were granted, and by 1912, only about half the infants born were vaccinated. The mild form of smallpox predominated, and the total number of smallpox deaths in England and Wales that year was 12. And at the time, they brought this clause in, but they were going to just do it for a short period. They looked upon it as a tremendous experiment. So Lord Lister described this tremendous experiment, and they decided that the change should be a temporary one, 5 years to begin with, and let's look at the effects of that. And after the 5 years expired, no terrible epidemics of smallpox occurred, much to the pro-vaccinist surprise. So this clause was just continued from year to year, but finally after 1907, they kind of gave up because smallpox was becoming much more of a non-issue. So I'm just going to quickly go through, I might have to skip some of the slides, but I'm quickly go through a couple of 2 or 3 doctors and scientists at that time. And the first doctor who was very concerned about vaccines, there's all his literature is in my archive library on my website, which is all free downloads. Dr. Charles Pearce, he was an English physician, homeopath, converted to, but he did become an opponent of vaccination and vivisection. So why did that occur? Dr. Pearce, as a medical referee to one of the largest and most prosperous life assurance corporations, started to become sceptical of the value of vaccination when he observed the apparent large mortality in vaccinated persons from what was commonly called consumption. And he wrote in his preface to his fellow doctors, really particularly, presenting the subject in a comparatively brief essay in the hope that his professional brethren, now wedded to the Jennererian theory, will fairly and without prejudice examine the question, lead to the suspension or repeal of all the acts of Parliament on vaccination, and that the people may exercise their inherent right of choice in medical matters. He began publicly to discuss, lecture against the practice. After full and impartial investigation of the vaccination, even in overseas observation, Dr. Pearce's findings fully confirmed to him that vaccination was erroneous, not protective, and that the operation often proved fatal. And here's a few comments by, I just took a few, there's so many, various doctors that Dr. Charles Pearce related their comments. Dr. Squirrel at the Smallpox Hospital stated that vaccination affords no security against smallpox and that the injurious consequences frequently follow vaccination. He gave 39 cases to support his conclusions. Dr. Greenhow, 1833, it is a well-known fact that smallpox after vaccination has become of much more frequent occurrence. Well, the same thing now. Measles is becoming much more a case in the vaccinated now. 81% of smallpox patients admitted to Highgate Hospital in London were found to be vaccinated. 81% were found to be vaccinated. And Dr. Birch, vaccination has been too often fatal and has introduced new disorders into the human system and is not a perfect security against the smallpox. And also another doctor who was a public vaccinator, and this is just an interesting observation he presented, just looking at smallpox disease, comparing it in the vaccinated and the unvaccinated. And he said when the children were strong and healthy, the smallpox was somewhat modified regardless of their vaccination status. However, children of a delicate constitution shared a different fate, especially those who had been previously debilitated by vaccination. And they went on to have the malignant form, and then obviously that would usually result in death. Just to go overseas, East Indies, an acting assistant surgeon, he said, and this was at a time when there was both inoculation and vaccination, it was in the 1830s, there appears to be no positive security against the disease either by vaccination or by inoculation. I've seen several cases where the patients have caught smallpox twice and have each time been very severely marked, and in 2 instances have died of the second attack. Certainly, by far, the greater number of our smallpox cases have occurred in persons vaccinated in India some 12 or 15 years ago. Now, this is a very quick case study, especially if you're a practitioner, because Dr. Charles Pearce had to talk to people about their health for their life assurance. This is just one of the cases. A widow of a tradesman presented herself to Dr. Pearce for examination in order that an assurance on her life might be affected. Family history. The widow, 40 years old, and 1 living brother, 44, both unvaccinated, and both had developed smallpox and recovered. They were the only survivors of a family of 10 children. The other younger siblings were all vaccinated. 5 of the 8 died in childhood, 2 at puberty, 1 at 18 years old. All died of consumption. Their mother always attributed their deaths to vaccination, as there had been no consumption in the family until then. Dr. Charles Pearce, he also said, the people have been lulled into a false sense of security, and vaccination has been insisted on instead of more rational means such as personal cleanliness, pure water, good drainage, unadulterated food, ventilation, and anything that will promote health. Surely the promotion of health is a far more rational means of preventing smallpox than the introduction into the human system of a diseased matter at the risk of injuring the health. And he said penalties should be for the supply of bad water, neglect of proper house repairs, and the adulteration of food, not for non-vaccination of children. And after 10 years of thorough investigation and 20 years of observation and experience, he concluded vaccination is an evil, a crime against nature, unclean in the source, dangerous in its practice, uncertain in its operation as a prophylactic. The insertion of an animal poison into the system of a healthy child is not justifiable. We're swiftly going to another chap then, Dr. Creighton's, and he was a British physician, medical author, highly regarded for his scholarly writings, of course, but was widely denounced later in his professional life for disputing the germ theory of infectious disease. And he was actually commissioned to write a piece on vaccination for the 9th edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica. And as it says here, starting with a bias in favour of the orthodox medical dogma, his findings convinced him that vaccination was devoid of scientific foundation, a mistake and no more entitled to respect than any other medical mistake. So, of course, the article dropped like a bombshell into the camp of the pro-vaccinists and created a lot of comment in the press. And these are I'm just going to show you a few examples of some of the findings, data that Creighton published. For example, in Bavaria, 1871, 30,742 cases, 29,429 were in the vaccinated persons. Prussia, the best re-vaccinated country, because by then they'd started to re-vaccinate in Europe, and its mortality from smallpox in the epidemic was higher than any other northern state. So the rest of the areas where they weren't even re-vaccinating, they had less deaths than the one country that was. And they're also often alleged, which they do now, is that the smallpox begins among the unvaccinated. They say the same for measles and all the others, in the unvaccinated. This is what he found in 1870, Cologne, first unvaccinated case was the 174th, and then Bonn, 42nd. and I'm not going to pronounce that, but 225th case was the first unvaccinated. So when he published this, another chap, Cruikshank, he was a bacteriologist at King's College, and he thought this is a bit strange, and so he decided to look into Creighton's findings and look into the whole subject. And the result was the 2 ponderous volumes, The History and Pathology of Vaccination, in which Cruikshank shows the practice to be uncertain, unscientific, and dangerous. And then we have another doctor testifying in the House of Commons, very interesting, 1871. He said, "I have vaccinated to within the last 5 years without thinking about it. Vaccination is so entirely secundum artem, which means just do it without thinking, because that's what they've been told. The large majority, meaning doctors, cannot think about it. We are continually coming upon venerable fallacies, but on this question, the vaccination question, prestige and interest prevent investigation." Another chap, Dr. Gunn, he said, "Whatever way we look at the question, it's certain that none of the methods now employed correspond with the discovery of Jenner, and that the time is not far distant when all will be rejected." He said that in 1882. He's probably turning in his grave now. Florence Nightingale, she also was very concerned about the vaccination, and she noted that there were no clear gains from vaccination and that the population did not increase with its use. And she was very sceptical of vaccination and fearful that the use of it would lessen the efforts in what she considered more important sanitary reforms. Another scientist at that time, Wallace, and Sir David Attenborough said, "For me, there's no more admirable character in the history of science than Wallace." So what did he have to say? I mean, he was linked to Darwin, and he was a co-discoverer with the evolution by natural selection, which I'm going to read now, so I'll just go past that one. And what did he say in his essay? "No careful tests were ever made by inoculating at the same time and in exactly the same way 2 groups of persons of similar age, constitution and health, the one group having been vaccinated, the other not, and none of them having had smallpox, and then have the resulting effects carefully described and compared by independent experts." He said such control experiments would now be required in any case of such importance, but it was never done in the early days of vaccination, and it appears never to have been done to this day. And that's 1898. We could kind of use the same paragraph even today, because they've never done those big comparison trials ever. And he also said, "For refusing to allow their children's health or even their lives to be endangered by inoculation into the system of disease-produced matter, hundreds and probably thousands of English parents have been fined, imprisoned, treated as criminals, while certainly thousands of infants have been officially done to death and other thousands injured for life." And he said, with all the horrors that Dr. Creighton had well described, that they'd never had a rational foundation either of physiological doctrine or carefully tested observations is now found to be disproved by a century's dearly bought experience. This disgrace of our much vaunted scientific age has been throughout supported by concealment of facts, telling against it by misrepresentation and by untruth. And he said, why this effort of secrecy in such a matter if there's nothing to hide? Surely it's public interest when official statistics should be made as correct as possible, and private persons who go to much trouble and expense in order to correct errors should be welcomed as public benefactors and assisted in every way, not treated as impertinent intruders on official privacy as it is too frequently the case. So we're going to quickly, I'm going to probably run out of time, but now let's look just quickly at some of the theories that came after Jenner at the latter part of the 1800s. Louis Pasteur, the father of the germ theory. His idea was that germs just come from outside randomly and invade us. He said that germs were non-changeable and that there was a specific germ for each disease and that the germ caused the disease, and the only action you could take would either kill the germ, avoid contamination, or protect from the germ. Now, in 1995, a book was published, The Private Science of Louis Pasteur, And Professor Geisen reviewed 10,000 pages of his diaries, and he reported that if the results of Louis Pasteur's experiments did not live up to his expectations, he modified his experiments until they provided the outcome desired to prove his ideas. This meant that Pasteur had deliberately falsified scientific experiments to suit his own purposes. And another doctor of more recent times in his book, he said also, in the light of these discoveries, it may yet turn out that the accepted theories about immunity, immune protection, immune defense, and antibodies, which are based on Pasteur's experiments, are based on false premises. At the same time, we had Béchamp. Most people haven't heard of him generally, and he had different ideas. He thought rather than germs, there were these microzymas, that's what he called them, and they were all in all living things and able to evolve into bacterial forms depending on the terrain, your internal soil, and that they could change also depending if you change the soil, they could change with it. And it was actually the toxicity of your internal soil that was causing the disease, not the germ. And so therefore, you would have to do things like change the soil by addressing living environment, lifestyle, nutrition, physical, emotional well-being. He considered the germ theory as the greatest scientific silliness of the age. However, Pasteur went down in history, the father of the germ theory, his lovely tomb there in marble surroundings. But he did say apparently at the end of his life, nearer the end, that Bernard, who was another fellow scientist, was correct. I was wrong. The microbe is nothing. The terrain is everything. So immunity, we're going to quickly have a quick glimpse of that. So if the germ is not the cause, then we do not need to be immune to the germ. Is immunity needed? It is well recognized that improved living conditions, especially clean water, reduce disease. So what does that actually mean? It means that individuals develop less disease due to social improvements. They do not need to develop an immunity to disease to prevent it occurring. They just need social living improvements, clean water, good sanitation, etc. So by improving the external environment, we create a more healthy internal environment, and then we reduce or eliminate disease. So why try and develop immunity from a vaccine when all we need is a healthy environment to reduce disease? If we recreated the environment of our ancestors going back even 200 years, it's highly probable that we would see diseases such as smallpox return. If we live in filth, foul air, no sanitation, overcrowding, how can we achieve good health by only introducing a vaccine? Will the word immunity eventually be recognized as just another term for health? And is it actually true that we gain immunity to a specific disease after experiencing that disease? That was the idea. You get the disease and you're supposed to be immune. That's what they believed. Well, you can experience the same disease more than once, and vaccination theory is based on the idea that once you've had a disease, it makes you immune. And some individuals do develop diseases like measles, chickenpox, smallpox more than once. And this is just an example, which was in 1809, where a doctor published, he cited 150 writers in different languages and in all ages since smallpox was first described, who had attested the occurrence of smallpox twice or thrice in the same individual. So then you've got the antibody theory. These are all theories: germ theory, immunity theory, now antibody theory. Another aspect of the vaccination theory, following on from all those other theories. And it goes, well, if you have a high level of antibody for a specific disease, you're immune. That's what the established view say. When a vaccine is administered, the theory is that the body will mount an immune response and produce antibodies, and that these antibodies will protect in the future should the individual come in contact with that particular germ. Even back in the 1950s, in a study in the UK, diphtheria, they were looking at diphtheria patients and their antibody levels. Some of the results obtained were so unusual and unexpected, so contradictory and indeed paradoxical that the inquiry, as originally envisaged, had to put and put into effect had to be brought to a temporary close. The paradox was this: on repeated occasions it was found that a sample of serum taken from a patient with a clear history of inoculation was found to contain quite large quantities of diphtheria antitoxin. So they had antibodies and they were inoculated and they still got diphtheria. We wrote to the World Health Organization in the 1990s. A few times letters were exchanged, and Dr. John Clements even said it's not possible to make an absolute generalization about what level of antibody is protective, while the precise level of antibodies needed for protection is not known. You know, sounding a bit like that vague description, you know, the description of Jenner when you don't have to be quite precise and a little bit vague. So here's a few questions you could ask even about antibodies. What level are supposed to be protective? How often do they even check on the levels? What about waning levels? Why do some individuals with high levels develop the disease and others with no detectable level, they don't? And how do they know that those vaccinated individuals who do not develop, say, measles, would have developed measles even if they had not been vaccinated? Because, of course, the diseases were coming down, so not everyone was developing measles. They just assumed that they protected them, but they may not have even developed the condition, especially if they're living in very good conditions. And, of course, there's papers, we probably have to we won't be able to read all of them, but they're now published 2012 in the medical literature, the re-emergence of measles in developed countries, time to develop the next generation vaccines. Measles outbreaks also occur even among highly vaccinated populations because of primary and secondary vaccine failure, which results in gradually larger pools of susceptible persons and outbreaks once measles is introduced. This leads to a paradoxical, you hear that a lot in these medical papers, situation whereby measles in highly immunized societies occurs primarily among those previously immunized. So apart from primary and secondary vaccine failures and waning antibody levels, what about the asymptomatic carriers that some vaccinees become? Are the vaccinated spreading the disease without realizing due to subclinical disease, meaning you haven't got any symptoms? Could the subclinical version in some vaccinees actually be a suppressed version of that disease? And what long-term outcomes may result in having a suppressed disease? And even asymptomatic, this was just about the whooping cough, and they're looking at whooping cough incidents because, and they talk about the reasons why it's occurring in the vaccinated. One, they say, oh, it's waning of protective immunity from the vaccine, or the evolution of another type of whooping cough bacteria, or low vaccine coverage. And the last one here, recent studies have suggested a fourth, asymptomatic transmission from individuals vaccinated with the current whooping cough vaccine. So they know that it's spreading. You've probably seen these before, just a few quick graphs to show this: smallpox, 1840 to the 1920s, and then you can see where they made the strong, tougher law came in the 1868. There was a threefold increase in deaths at that time, and then it fell, and then it started to come down again. But really, when they really pushed for all those vaccinations, smallpox vaccine, that's when you saw a massive increase then. And the same here, this is whooping cough. By the 1950s, when they introduced the immunisation, you can see the decline in the mortality had been achieved just by all those things we talked about, sanitation and living conditions. Same thing in measles, 1968, they first brought the first single measles vaccine out. But if we can achieve all that reduction and deaths, reduce severity, reduce cases without even having any kind of vaccine, why didn't we just continue along those lines? And of course, BCG, also against tuberculosis, introduced in the 50s, same story there. A few doctors, more modern doctors, I met this doctor, he passed away when he was about 89, and he said we should be aware, very much and concerned about the terrible damage, sometimes obvious but often insidious, caused by our children, caused to our children by vaccination, which is covered up, trivialised, and now in the case of whooping cough, denied altogether. His son was severely damaged as a baby with the smallpox vaccine. That's why he opened his eyes to it. Before that, he'd always valued vaccination, but he spent the rest of his life trying to get justice for all the vaccine-damaged children. Professor Gordon Stewart, I also met him. He got into his 90s, and he was a very highly respected doctor. We'll jump onto, we don't need to see all his qualifications, but here he said, "My own view, based upon some years of observation and experience, is quite firm. I supported the use of vaccine in 1951 and without little hesitation until 1972. He gave his 4 children the whooping cough in the 50s. What did he say next? I would not dream of doing so again because it has become clear to me not only that the vaccine is incompletely protective, but also that the side effects, which I thought to be temporary, are in fact dangerous, unpredictably so." And he also carried on saying, "There's no doubt in my mind that in the UK alone, some hundreds, if not thousands of well infants have suffered irreparable brain damage needlessly, and that their lives and those of their parents have been wrecked in consequence." That's in 1980. Graham Wilson, Sir Graham Wilson, when he retired, he wrote the book Hazards of Immunisation. He was a director of Public Health Laboratories, which is now called Public Health England. He said, "In a truly democratic country, opposition and the freedom to express opinions contrary to those of the majority are the breath of life, and it is thoroughly wholesome for long adopted practices," meaning vaccination, "to be submitted from time to time to critical scrutiny, lest the accumulated weight of precedent is allowed to obscure the need for their discontinuance." And he also said, this is a very revealing, "Finally, I cannot express too strongly my gratitude to Dr. O'Brien, who long after his retirement from the directorship of the Wellcome Physiological Research Laboratories at Beckenham, handed over to me a valuable set of documents with which he felt unable to cope, and without which it is doubtful whether the present book would ever have been written." So that other chap had a vast amount of data on vaccine injuries, and he could have had a big bonfire, but he did actually probably feel in his retirement he needed to pass it on to someone else, maybe some kind of guilty conscience. There's many doctors now. This is just one in the States at the present. As we see the number of vaccines added to the schedule, we are also seeing a tremendous increase in the number of chronic diseases in children. World Health Organization, 2016, they now produce a download PDF, How to Respond to Vocal Vaccine Deniers in Public, teaching the health professionals how to debate with people on the TV and the radio. Just a couple of years ago, 2017, they were a big discussion about mandatory, UK doctors re-examine case for mandatory vaccinations. This particular doctor in London based, parents who willingly choose not to vaccinate their children despite the safe evidence base are displaying negligent behaviours and that are in some cases seriously harming the health of children who have no say or control over this decision and in extreme situations costing lives. Luckily there are other doctors who are against the idea of mandatory. Vaccine hesitancy is a new medical condition. Misinformation lingers in memory, failure of 3 pro-vaccination strategies. It's just talking about how wonderful vaccines are. However, many people appear hesitant, doubting the benefits and worrying over their safety. I said on the radio when I was up against this chap who'd published it, rather than studying the mental state of those who are vaccine hesitant and creating strategies to push any concerns out of their mind, shouldn't they be looking at why people are becoming vaccine hesitant instead? Do not mention the V word. Are you medically qualified? Otherwise you have no right to discuss this subject. And if you are medically qualified and have concerns, well, you may be advised that your career prospects will suffer if you continue with this line of research, a medical heretic. Labelling is a technique the medical establishment are using more and more on anyone who dares question the V word. So I actually sent an article to British Medical Journal, and they published it, and I included a few labels that I suggested that were rife in the medical world. Vaccine study reluctance syndrome, vaccine ineffectiveness deniers, vaccine injuries and death disassociation complex, and obsessive coincidence disorder. I know, I was quite pleased they published it. Anyway, mandatory vaccines, unfortunately, here, just a sort of brief list. Belgium, Croatia, Czech, Italy now, 10 mandatory with fines. France introduced last year. It's getting more and more, basically, and some are fines, and some are even, there's one that even suggests a possible jail sentence in Croatia. We've got no mandates yet as such in these countries, although a few days ago Germany announced measles vaccine would be compulsory in March 2020, but I understand that it has got to go through a number of processes. It's not law yet, and there's lots of protests being arranged, so they won't easily let that happen, but it's a huge, huge worry. Okay, at this present time, mandatory vaccines in the UK are now breathing down our necks. Censorship is on the increase by mainstream media on anyone who questions vaccination. There's so much censorship. I've had so many experiences personally about TV and radio and how they just cancel the interview, or they edit you down to 10 seconds, etc. Anti-extremism software is to be used now to tackle vaccine disinformation. This software for anti-extremism, this is how we're being labelled. World Health Organization declare vaccine deniers as in the top 10 public health threats. And at the end of one of my rapid responses for the British Medical Journal in 2017, I just ended with, "It is time for independent examination without recrimination, and not a time for coercive measures which inflict upon our freedom of choice." And I just fitted it in, so thank you very much for listening.